Hey guys, Nathan here, Absurd Being, Kierkegaard number 7 today. And we are moving into the 3 spheres of existence. So let's get that diagram up, and we can see that we're in the top right corner there. 3 spheres of existence. There's the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. And there's a whole lot of other stuff in there, and some other boxes and things outside the central image of the 3 spheres in my diagram, and we'll get to all of that stuff in future videos. We'll probably spend 3 to 4 videos on this topic in its entirety, because there's quite a bit to get through. But today I'm just going to focus on what each of these 3 spheres means for Kierkegaard, and we'll go from there. So most of this information, especially for the aesthetic and the ethical, come from either or. So that's the place to go if you want to kind of get a description and a feel for what those 2 spheres are like. And I think the postscript's the other place to go for a deeper fleshing out of those 2 spheres, plus a far more detailed accounting of the religious sphere. He goes into a lot of detail in that sphere in the postscript. So those are the two books you want to read if you want to understand what Kierkegaard's getting at with these 3 spheres. But with that said, without any further ado, let's get into the first of the 3, the aesthetic. So the aesthetic, what do we have here? Well, the aesthetic sphere is basically characterized by the immediate. It's immediate pleasure, essentially. And Kierkegaard talks about it as being immediate sensuous enjoyment. It's egotism. It's a flight from boredom. And it's purely externally directed. So these are just all different ways that Kierkegaard talks about this sphere. And it is the lowest of the 3. So there is kind of a progression. The aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. There is a progression, actually. And this is the lowest, this is the most base of the 3. In a slightly more metaphysical sense, the aesthetic sphere is characterized by possibility over actuality. So the emphasis in this sphere for someone living under the aesthetic category is over possibility. What can happen? That's where the pleasure derives from. So it's not concerned with actual concrete existence. Rather, it's this transient kind of temporal, temporary, although temporal as well, pleasure, gratification seeking. And to that extent, it's more concerned with the possible than with the actual. And in a nice sentence, Kierkegaard describes this sphere in either or by saying it's to live in such a way that the person is immediately what he or she is. So there's no kind of depth to this existence. It's a very shallow, like I say, immediate gratification kind of characterizes this sphere. Of course, as I said, aesthetic enjoyment comes from outside the individual, so things like wealth, glory, nobility, those kinds of things. But it can also come from inside the individual, although when it does, these things are not posited by him or her. So it's things like health, beauty, developing one's talent, satisfying one's desires. these kinds of things. So there's no sort of cultivation going on here. It's just base satisfaction of desires, or realizing kind of what's already there in terms of one's health and beauty. He says this sphere is rooted in despair, and the reason for that is that all of its desires are transitory. So there's nothing lasting to be had in the aesthetic sphere. Now there is no actuality. It's all about the possible. It's all about these fleeting kind of grasping these fleeting pleasures, and kind of extracting whatever you can from them, whatever pleasure you can, until you're bored of that and it's time to move on to the next one. So mood is important in this sphere because it's kind of where pleasure's derived from. And Johannes in Either Or, the seducer in the seducer's diary, he's always calculating and scheming and trying to manipulate the situation and people in order to derive the maximum amount of pleasure. So he's very much concerned with, he's very concerned with the aesthetics of things. He wants to make things beautiful, make things aesthetically pleasing. But by definition, these are temporary, fleeting kind of satisfactions or desires that he's satisfying. And that's the aesthetic. Now, in the postscript, Kierkegaard also talks about the boundary between the aesthetic and the ethical, and that's what we're going to look at next. And that boundary is irony. So the boundary between the two, between the aesthetic and the ethical sphere, is irony, which is basically the unity of ethical passion and culture. Now, what exactly does that mean? Well, a quote from Kierkegaard should help clarify this a little bit. So irony arises from continually placing the particularities of the finite together with the infinite ethical requirement and letting the contradiction come about. So this boundary area is arises when we're getting a glimpse of what's coming in the ethical. We're getting a glimpse of this understanding kind of beyond and above our transient egotistical self and the kind of pleasure seeking instant gratification sphere that we've been living in up until this point. And so, but we're not fully out of the aesthetic yet, but we're in the kind of in a transition phase. And so we're seeing this infinite ethical requirement kind of taking shape a little bit, and we're juxtaposing it with the particularities of the finite, with what we've been concerned with in the aesthetic sphere, and this is creating a contradiction. And we're seeing that contradiction, and it's that contradiction that Kierkegaard calls irony. So it inwardly stresses the I in relation to the ethical requirement. Outwardly, it abstracts from the personal I as one finitude among other finitudes and particulars. And interestingly enough, most people, Kierkegaard says, live in the opposite way. They inwardly they don't stress the individual in relation to ethical requirements, and outwardly that's where the emphasis is on the outward as being real and all that matters. Whereas with when we're in this boundary state of irony, that's reversed, and now the focus is inward on the ethical requirement for the I, for the individual, and outwardly we abstract out from the personal I as one individual among others. The ironist, however, hasn't examined him or herself in relation to the culture and decided to live in relation to universal ethical principles, though. But like I say, that consciousness, that awareness of these universal ethical principles is emerging, is taking shape. And it's at that point, or as that awareness grows, we move into the second sphere, which is the ethical. So we've made it to the second sphere, the ethical, and you may have noticed there I wrote ethical with irony as incognito. We'll look at that in just a moment. But first, let's just have a look at what this ethical realm entails. And we've kind of touched on it already. So it's characterized by these universal, eternal, we can say, infinite principles, which in part are made up of social norms, but there's also a deeper kind of reflective element to them. And that's a key part of the ethical sphere, is reflection. And again, that's a departure from the immediate way that one lives in the aesthetic sphere. So the quote, well, this isn't the quote, but the corresponding phrase to describe the ethical. Remember, the aesthetic, I said to live in the aesthetic is to live in such a way that the person is immediately what he or she is. Well, the corresponding proposition for the ethical is to live in such a way that the person becomes what they become. And so we've talked a lot about becoming, and we've talked a lot about being before. And so this, we can see that transition, or in these two spheres. In the aesthetic, one is immediately what one is. But in the ethical, one becomes what one becomes. So it's that switch from being to becoming. So we're already seeing how some of these pieces fit together in Kierkegaard's philosophy. So this is an important point, which I don't know if it's a common kind of misconception, but I suspect it might be. People tend to think of, I imagine, that with these three spheres, we kind of we start in the aesthetic, then we move to the ethical, and then finally we move to the religious. And although that does happen, we're not leaving the aesthetic completely. The aesthetic, when we move to the ethical, the aesthetic isn't abandoned. And that's why in that diagram you can see that these aren't separate independent spheres. Each sphere, the aesthetic, the ethical, the religious, every sphere prior is enclosed within the sphere above it. So the aesthetic is part of the ethical, and the ethical and the aesthetic are both part of the religious. And that's what I was trying to capture with that, by having those three spheres kind of one within each other. And so, back to the point, the ethical sphere doesn't do away with the aesthetic. Rather, it chooses the aesthetic self ethically. And that's a nice way to put this. And it's an either or. The once one reaches the ethical realm, one chooses the aesthetic self ethically. I really like that expression. And the reason is that the aesthetic self, remember, is worldly. It's real and concrete. It is what it is. That's Sartre. That's Sartre. But it lives in such a way that it is immediately what it is. And so there is this element of kind of tangible, real existence to it. And we don't want to lose that. Right? We want to keep that. That's important for human existence, for a lived subject. So we don't get rid of it, but we just choose that aesthetic self, that self that's in the world. We choose it ethically. So again, it's not this kind of moving beyond the aesthetic to the ethical. It's more expanding oneself beyond the aesthetic. So it rises above despair. Remember, the aesthetic was characterized by despair because everything was transient. It was just based on desire, the fulfillment or the satisfaction of transient desires, external desires. The ethical sphere rises above desire because it's built on something more solid. It's built on the actual, rather than the possible and these transient, fleeting desires. And the other point I've got here before we move on is the ethical individual chooses him or herself as his or her task. And the task is to become universal, is to become, to cultivate that relation with the universal ethical principles. So it's to rise above that egotism that we saw characterized the aesthetic sphere. Okay, so that's that. What else do I have here? So there's it does highlight the contradiction, the sphere between the finite and the infinite. I've talked a little bit about that already. The latter, the infinite, being the ethical, and the former being the particular self that's in the world. That's in a way that's the ethical component. The aesthetic component. And in that way, it deals with particular existing individuals, not concerned with humanity as a whole. So the ethical sphere deals, while dealing with these universal principles, its main focus is on the lived, actual individual, not kind of humanity as a whole, or the society, or the tribe that you belong to. It's not concerned with these kinds of things. So things like utilitarianism, the maximizing pleasure or utility, the greatest happiness for the greatest number. These things, this is not ethics for Kierkegaard. The ethical is inherently individualistic, dealing with particular existing individuals. So there is that kind of tension between the two, the finite and the infinite, right? The infinite, the universal the universal ethical principles, and the finite existing particular individual. And I think I'm just going to repeat that if I read this next section, but I'll read it anyway, just in case there's something more. The ethical is the universal, and as such is the abstract. So that's another way to put this, another way to think about this. However, the ethical can only be realized when the ethical individual makes him or herself the universal. That is, expresses his or her life in the universal, not by getting rid of the concrete, but by permeating it with the universal. So again, just another way to flesh out what I mean here when I say there's this contradiction between the finite and the infinite, this interplay between the two. And so interestingly enough, Kierkegaard says that being the universal and therefore abstract, ethics can tell us, for example, what to do, but it can't give us any details. So the example he gives is ethics can tell us to marry. We ought to marry. We ought to get married. That's the universal concept. But it can't tell us who to marry, which is the concrete, accidental, the particular, the individual. So it operates at this general universal level and can't give specific advice. And that's an idea that crops up again in Heidegger. I think I remember reading that when I read through Being and Time. So observation, still in the ethical, there are a couple more points here. Observation is always self-observation for Kierkegaard. I can only know my own actuality. Anyone else I know through thought. I know by thinking of them, and that means I know them only as possibility. We talked about that a lot when we talked about inwardness. You can't ever truly know what another person is up to, and therefore you can't judge anyone, because all you see, you never have access to anything more than kind of the external, when really what really counts is precisely the opposite of that, the inward. So that idea comes up again here when we're talking about the ethical. And however, the individual's own ethical actuality can be known for certain. So you can know absolutely that you intended this or that particular outcome, or you intended to do this or that, and that can be known for certain because it's inward, it's within you. So what's the story with this irony is incognito? What's the point here? Well, let me read a quote and then we'll break it down. So the irony is incognito because what people think of someone like that is always nothing has importance for him. And why not? Because for him the ethical is absolutely important. He differs in this from the common run of people for whom so many things are important, yes, almost everything, but nothing absolutely important. So, what are we getting at here? The irony then is, as we said, the contradiction between the infinite ethical requirement and the particular finite. But the idea is that the ethicist's irony hides them. It conceals them from others. So other people don't know, can't look at them, for example, and say, this person is not on the aesthetic plane. He or she is in the ethical. It's the ethicist is hidden by irony, by the fact that that it appears that they have nothing is important to them, because the only thing that's important is the ethical. So someone looking from the outside can think, this person doesn't care about any individual, any particular, he doesn't care about you or me. This person only cares about these grandiose universal principles. But it's precisely that the contradiction, the irony of the two, the finite and the infinite, that kind of gives cover for the ethicist. And remember that is something else that we've talked about in the past. The idea of deception, because the inward is what really matters, and Kierkegaard wants to even go beyond just, I mean, that's the case. You can't know someone else from the inside, but he wants to even go a step further and say we ought to deceive in order to teach appropriately, in order for the person observing us or looking at us or listening to us, in order for them to come to the realization on their own, through their own inwardness, and thereby come to the decision themselves and make that important decision themselves. So the irony here of that contradiction acts as kind of cover. I hope that explains that. Have I explained that enough? I think I have. I think I better just move on from there. I've got a long section. It's not a quote, but I'm just going to go through this before I wrap up the aesthetic and the ethical. And it's in either or, and Kierkegaard talks about the difference between the aesthetic and the ethical. I'm just going to read through what I wrote because it helps to give some insight into what the ethical is here. So the problem, he says, is that for Johannes, who's the aesthete in either or, the seducer, the problem for him is that he sees the beautiful in a single individual in nature, seeing it as this particular thing, as opposed to the universal, where even the accidental and insignificant appear to contain the imprint of beauty. Now William, the judge, in either or, he disputes this. And he says teleology, having a goal, moving towards some end, requires movement, obviously, towards that end. But what Johannes calls beautiful lacks movement, because the beautiful in nature appears all at once, as in, for example, a work of art. So to see a painting is to be presented with the beautiful all at once, and any movement occurs not in the beautiful object itself, but in the observer, the person looking at the painting. Movement, therefore, means leaving the realms of art and nature and entering that of freedom, and so of ethics. Since an individual has his or her own teleology within themselves as the inner goal, the concrete absolute self towards which the individual strives, the movement then will be an inner one. So it's an inner movement we're talking about. However, this movement cannot ignore the world around the individual, or the self would remain an abstraction. We would lack that concrete actuality that's so important in the ethical sphere. So in order to complete the movement to self, the individual must open him or herself to the whole of reality. And then the quote, so his movement will be from himself through the world to himself. Now this is, especially that last quote, this is, if you've read Being and Nothingness, this is exactly what Sartre is talking about with his circuit of selfness. He talks about going through the world in order to know oneself. And to come back to oneself, one has to go out into the world and then back, and that's the circuit of selfness, and that's exactly what Kierkegaard's talking about here. And so he's framing the difference between the aesthetic and the ethical here in terms of the beautiful, which we normally perhaps would associate with aesthetic, the aesthetic realm. but Judge William argues that it's present in the ethical realm as well, and it's even present to a greater degree than it is in the aesthetic realm. So back to the story, choosing oneself in this way is ethical, but possessing one's own teleology within oneself is also beautiful. Hence, the ethical is beautiful. And he goes on to say that, Judge William that is, goes on to say that he sees the beautiful in everybody, even the humblest waiter, because completely opposite to Johannes, he sees in this individual person the universal man at the same time. He sees a concrete yet universal being with his teleology within him, realizing the task that he has set for himself. So that's a really, like I say, I thought it was a nice way to understand the difference between the two, and just to see that it's not we're not leaving the aesthetic realm and moving into a different realm completely. We're kind of expanding, growing out from that aesthetic realm and becoming and including this higher realm, and which takes the aesthetic and kind of transforms it in the process. And so obviously, when Kierkegaard's talking about the ethical, he's not just talking about doing what's right and what's wrong. So it's not he's not about forming like a set of commandments or ethical maxims, and he's definitely not about utilitarian kind of calculus. This is, for him, the ethical is it's a expansion from the petty egotistical concerns of the aesthetic realm to the more universal, to an appreciation of the infinite within the finite. And that doesn't mean that one can't see ethical maxims from this, but it's not going to be a case of that this is better for society as a whole, so we better do this. So that's our ethical. These are our ethical rules. It's not going to be something as simplistic as that. Kierkegaard's talking about a way of life, a way of living with these spheres of existence. So that's the ethical sphere, and next we'll look at the boundary between the ethical and the religious, which is humour. Okay, so the boundary state of humour is shares a lot in common with the boundary state between the aesthetic and the ethical, irony. And humour arises from, again, this contradiction that comes about from the particularities of the finite and the universal, the infinite, on the other hand. But instead of the infinite being the universal ethical obligations, the universal here, or the infinite here, is the God idea. So it's the so humour, in short, is the contradiction that arises when we look at, on one hand, the individual finite particular and the infinite in the God idea. And that's basically it. The reason that there's the humorist, Kierkegaard calls him the humorist, hasn't made it into the religious yet, is because the humorist doesn't relate to God with religious passion. Again, it's the God idea has kind of come up. It features for the humorist, but he or she hasn't embraced that fully with the passion that we'll see come to fruition in the next sphere of existence, the religious. Okay, so the religious has humor as incognito, and you can probably see where that's going to go. We'll look at that in just a moment. But first, let's get a definition of the religious. What are we talking about? The quote is, the religious is the totality of guilt consciousness in the single individual before God in relation to an eternal happiness. Now that pretty much gets everything out there. That quote has just kind of put everything into a nutshell for us. The guilt consciousness, so that there's this element of suffering and guilt built into the religious sphere. The single individual, so it's individualistic. It's as anything with Kierkegaard is, very inward focused. Before God, so there's a relation with God, and also there's a relation to an eternal happiness, which is really, and that comes up a lot, and it's really the kind of the ultimate end, for the existing individual is this eternal happiness. And I guess in a religious sense, we're talking about heaven here. Okay, so again, we are highlighting the contradiction between the finite and the infinite, but in the religious sphere, the infinite is the God idea. And again, this doesn't mean that the ethical is abandoned, rather it gets a different expression. So in exactly the same way that the ethical took on board the aesthetic, the religious takes on the ethical, but gives it a different expression. And that expression is a paradoxical, absolute expression. And we'll talk more about the paradox of religion later, because we're going to break this religious sphere down into a lot more detail. I'm just going to very briefly talk about what the religious entails here. We'll really get into the nitty gritty in the next video. So the God relationship requires, one thing that's important here is the absolute difference. We are absolutely inferior to God, and so it's not just, and the reason Kierkegaard uses that word absolute is it's not just if we could be a little bit better, or if this happened, we could close that gap a little bit. It's an absolute difference. There is no bridging this gap. God is just infinitely better than us. And the appropriate form then that the religious takes is humility. So this is where Kierkegaard goes full on Christian, and that's what we're talking about here: humility, guilt consciousness. And so it's interesting though to break this down a little bit and just talk about why there is this absolute difference. And our human lowliness is precisely the fact that we are existing, that we are finite as well as infinite. And the quote, just to give some more, to express this a little bit more, is part of a human being's lowliness is being temporal and unable within temporality to lead the life of eternity uninterruptedly. And if his life is in temporality, then it is eo ipso piecemeal. If it is piecemeal, it is of course mixed with diversion, and in diversion he has gone from his God relationship. So there's nothing we can do about this. This is just a part of what it means to be a human being. We are infinitely low in the eyes of God. We're infinitely inferior compared to God. And this is what's really interesting about existentialism in general, is the way that it really, all the existentialist thinkers really look at this kind of thing. What is it to be a human being? What's essential in human existence? And often, even when, in this case, it's heavily dependent on the religious, and kind of, it doesn't make any sense without Christianity, obviously. But despite that, Heidegger talks about things like inauthenticity, and Sartre has bad faith, and these are things that are just built into what it is to be a human being, and they're kind of negative, but in the sense that they're unavoidable, that negativity is kind of stripped away a little bit. And so Heidegger says again and again that inauthenticity is not a bad thing. It's not meant to be negative. It's just what it is to be a human being. And unfortunately, in this case, for Kierkegaard, it is negative. And we are lowly humans in relation to God, and there's no getting around that. So the last thing I want to look at here is why the comic as incognito. And I've got a quote which I'll read first, and then we'll break it down a little bit. The comic emerges through hidden inwardness's relation to the surroundings, as the religious one actually hears and sees what, when put together with his heartfelt passion, has a comic effect. Therefore, even if two who are religious conversed with each other, the one would seem comic to the other, for each of them would constantly have his inwardness in mind, and together with this, now hear what the other said, and hear it as comic, because neither of them dared express the hidden inwardness directly. So again, it's the same kind of idea as irony, as incognito, for the boundary between the aesthetic and the ethical. The religious person's humour serves to hide them, serves to kind of give them cover, preserving that inwardness, in the way of kind of deception again. So the humour, again, is seeing the contradiction between the infinite relationship with God and the particular finite. So the religious person sees this, and but can't and won't kind of give voice to the hidden inwardness directly. And so whatever one hears and talks about and sees in finite existence, in normal everyday life, obviously is going to raise contradictions when one considers the infinite, the relation with God. The fact that we're living our lives, doing all these little things that we do, driving to work, working, picking up the kids, whatever it is that we're doing. These all can't be viewed in any other way except as humorous, and as a contradiction when we consider the infinite God idea, that we're in a way kind of straddling those two worlds, that we're kind of straddling, and so that seeing things in that way serves to act as kind of a form of deception, or a way of keeping one's inwardness inward, so that preserving one's inwardness, I'm going to say it again, preserving one's inwardness so that other people can't get access to it. Not that they can anyway, it's impossible, but that's this idea of the comic as incognito just gives us an extra kind of barrier of separation, if you like. And that's what Kierkegaard's about. He is very individualistic. It's all about, the whole of Kierkegaard's philosophy is about the individual, not about the group. So yeah, like he said, at most, all you could detect in the religious person is the note of humor in them. So you would never know that a religious person is religious or is living in that religious sphere. You would never know. You could never know. At the most, you might catch a glimpse of that humor, but that's obviously not going to be enough to draw any conclusions. And that is basically where I'm going to stop today. So we've just covered those three spheres of existence. Let me do a quick summary and then we'll get out of here. Alright, so the first thing we looked at was the aesthetic, which was characterized by immediate sensuous enjoyment and was to live in such a way that the person is immediately what he or she is. And we saw the mood was an important part of this sphere. The next area we looked at was the boundary between the aesthetic and the ethical, and the boundary was irony, and this involves seeing the contradiction between the infinite ethical requirement and the particularities of the finite. Then we got to the ethical sphere, where we're dealing with universal principles and reflection, and this was to live in such a way that the person becomes what they become. And it's nice that we see that distinction there between being and becoming. So the ethicist chooses the aesthetic ethically, so we don't get rid of the aesthetic. And it's a combination of the inner and the outer, the infinite and the finite. And its incognito is irony. The next thing we looked at was the boundary between the ethical and the religious, and this was humor, and involves seeing the contradiction between the finite and the infinite in terms of the God idea. And then the last section was the religious sphere, which we defined as the totality of guilt consciousness in the single individual before God in relation to an eternal happiness. And again, with this, the ethical isn't abandoned, rather it gets a paradoxical absolute expression. I didn't talk about that at all in this video. We'll talk about that in much more detail later. And its incognito was humor. And so that's the three spheres. Like I said, that's just an introduction to this, and we'll really drill home some ideas, particularly in the religious. There's a lot to uncover in the religious. That's basically all I'm going to say about the aesthetic and the ethical. But in coming videos, we'll break this religious idea down, and that's just because that's what Kierkegaard's all about. You know, you can't really talk about Kierkegaard without getting into the religious. So that's what we'll do in the next video. Thanks again for listening, guys, and I'll see you soon.